So, Cold War. At the end of World War II, the legacy is the Cold War between the West and the communist world. During this time, things that happen, British colonies get independent. So today's kids don't know that Britain used to be a big empire, but most of Africa, most of those countries were British colonies. Most of the Middle East was British, and they all get independent. 1948, Israel is created, and there's immediately a war with the Arabs, and we still live in the age of the Arab-Israeli wars. China, for a long time, is isolated until the late 80s. China will remain a closed country. United States fights the Korean War and the Vietnam War, in both cases against communists. European community is born. That's pretty important actually for Europeans. Europeans stop killing each other, with the exception of Kosovo, there's been, and now Ukraine, but those are really east. But there hasn't been any war in Western Europe, which is new. The Sputnik opens the space to humans. The Berlin Wall is created. That's usually considered a symbol of the Cold War. It will last 30 years. And 1969, we put a man on the moon. Soviet Union. So Soviet Union was an interesting experiment, but obviously didn't go too well. The Cold War really involved the whole world. Because if you think, I call it World War III, really, and now I call the various Islamic worlds, World War IV. World War III, why? Look at that. These are all the wars fought between armies that were sponsored by the United States and the Soviet Union, one way or another. By the West, Soviet Union. In some cases it was France, but still. It involves a large part of the world. The funny thing is that the two main contenders never killed one soldier of the other army, so it was a funny war. It was actually a perfect war. You killed somebody else's soldiers. Britain has gone, France has largely gone. Germany and Japan are really the economic miracles. Germany and Japan are the two countries that were destroyed. They obviously lost World War II, right? They obviously lost. They were obviously destroyed, occupied. Germany split in two. Japan was de facto a US colony until 1950 or 52. And guess what? They come back and they become two formidable economies. To this day, largest economy US, second is China, third is Japan, fourth is Germany. So pretty amazing. And they become also very pacifist. These are two countries that have written in the constitution they cannot have an army for offensive purpose. India gets independent. That's really the end of the British Empire. Without India, the British Empire is no longer an empire. Churchill must have died a very bitter man because he won World War II, but then he came to realize he had lost empire. So to this day, it's not clear who really won World War II, other than the United States and the Soviet Union. So anyway, India. So the partition of India is a big tragedy. India becomes independent, but we always forget to say India and Pakistan and Burma and Sri Lanka become independent. This was all the British India. And then Pakistan will split in Pakistan and Bangladesh. And out of these things there will be huge casualties. Some of the biggest massacres happened in the Indian subcontinent. China went from one famine to the other, from one disaster to the other. The Civil War killed untold numbers, tens of millions, we don't know the exact number. And then it got involved in the Korean War, where they lost a lot of soldiers. Then they had the Great Leap Forward, which is the mass industrialization of China, and it ended miserably. And in the famine, 20 million people estimated died. And then they had the Cultural Revolution, there was a revolution against the intellectuals to bring back people to real work. Tens of millions of people died. So we went from one tragedy to the other. I forgot to say, this can be interesting. Soviet Union and China, they both adopted Marxism and they became communists and so on. But the revolution really meant different things, because Lenin and then Stalin, they had in mind the workers, industry. They wanted to industrialize the country, and they wanted to give the power to the workers. They saw the peasants as the problem. In fact, one of the very first plans that Lenin had was to move peasants to the cities, because cities tended to be workers' places. The countryside was the place where they still, the priest was still important, and they weren't really too convinced about the communist ideas. So the Soviet Union, the emphasis was on the workers. Mao won in the countryside. The Long March and his army came from the rural part of China. So in China, communism really meant the peasants. Only at this point, China starts getting industrialized. So two different ways to get to communism. Yeah? The United States is going through the civil rights movement and gay liberation, women's liberation. The first one there is Betty Friedman. How do you pronounce her last name?
Friedan.
And gay rights movement. Then the first student riots started Berkeley, UC Berkeley. Then the hippies. And that's the time of the Vietnam War. So that's the time where we are. In communications, transportation, revolution goes on. Biggest thing here are the Shinkansen and the Concorde. Shinkansen, the bullet train.
Is what?
Shinkansen in Japan is the first bullet train, high-speed train. And then the second one will be in France. The Concorde was the first supersonic passenger airplane. Anybody who tells you we live in the age of progress, remind them that we don't have a plane today that flies as fast as we were flying in 1969, or as fast as rich people were flying in 1969. Okay, so we actually fly for the first time since the invention of the airplane. We are actually not. We don't have a faster plane. Cars. Communication, so we have the telephone cable, first satellite, Telstar. And the revolution in the media continues. You know, we get the transistor radio, that's a major, there will be a major improvement. The record, rock and roll. And space, first the Sputnik, then the first astronaut, Gagarin, then eventually Neil Armstrong on the moon. And this is interesting. How did we put a man on the moon? Actually using very old physics. You know, people sometimes don't study how it worked. We just used the traditional Newton's gravity, and we just sent it to the opposite side of the moon so that the gravity would send it back. It's kind of very, very obsolete technology, but it worked. It worked. You don't need Einstein to go to the moon. You don't need Einstein to go to Mars. Now, if we want to go near a black hole, then we probably need Einstein. And as I said, astronomy changed the way we see the world. Yes, all these numbers are mind-boggling. You know, nearest star is 4.3 light years. Light years is colossal. Physics, the new things are essentially the Big Bang quarks. Everything else is still largely speculation again. The idea of the Big Bang is simple. I mean, if the universe is expanding, it must have started somewhere. That somewhere already contained all the matter/energy in one point. And then there was this explosion, and that went through a number of stages, eventually created the whole universe. So that's one of the big things that happened after World War II. And the other one is the Ethereal Quarks. By studying what were considered the elementary particles, we find out they're not elementary, except the electron. But the nucleus of the atom, they found out there was a proton and a neutron. But then studying protons and neutrons, they realized these are not elementary particles. There's particles inside a proton and inside a neutron. Those are quarks. So then, quarks. That's the picture today. So there are the elementary particles, you can organize them in different ways. But one family is the family of the electron, which has the electron, 3 types of neutrinos, some other particles. And then you have the quarks. There are 6 quarks. So there are 6 in the family of quarks and 6 in the family of the electron, which is called leptons. And these particles interact through some fundamental forces, and those 4 fundamental forces use virtual particles. And the photon is the most famous. The gluon is the particle for the quarks. And the Higgs boson, if you've heard of it, is the particle field that gives these particles mass. It's always been a mystery why things have mass in the first place.
But it has been confirmed, right? Or
in physics, I always wait a little bit to make sure, but yeah, they observed something that behaves like the Higgs boson. Yes. So that's the picture today, and it's not a pretty picture because for each of these particles you have an antiparticle. So the grand total is 60-something elementary particles, which is not what they had in mind when they started looking at elementary particles. Okay, so that's physics still going on. You probably heard of the string theory, you know, it's theory of everything. There's still so much we can't figure out. In fact, as we speak, more than 90% of the universe is either dark energy or dark matter, neither of which has an explanation. So actually, physics itself says that more than 90% of the universe, we don't know what it is. Still way to go. Of course, one problem, we can't go there and perform experiments. We are here on this little planet, the middle of this big universe, trying to figure out what's out there. Lots of progress in medicine. This is one of the disciplines that is underestimated in a sense. Right? People were dying of a toothache back in the days. The chances of reaching my age were very low, just because of all the possible diseases that would kill you. Most of these diseases now they are solved in minutes. You just go to the hospital, get a shot, and voila, done. You know. So there's been a lot of progress. Think of the polio. Polio was killing children all over the world, leaving a lot of them invalid for the rest of their life. So that changed a lot. And in between, there's antibiotics, and there's all the different ways to kill germs that we invented. So lots of diseases disappeared. And the birth control pill, of course, also had a big social effect. Sperry comes next. I think I have a slide for the brain. And this was not medicine back then. It is becoming. But we start understanding more and more about this thing, about the constituents of our body. Inside the cells, there's something called DNA, and in 53 we figure out the structure of the DNA. And so we start understanding the genes, how genes work. We're still trying to understand exactly how they work, but of course a lot of progress has been done since 53, just 60 years ago. The brain, and so we spoke about psychology that was making progress just using practical experiments and trying to find simple answers to obvious things. Well, finally we start understanding what is in the brain. The brain is made of neurons. A very important moment is when we realize neurons are very simple things. They behave like switches on and off. The connections are the intelligence of the brain. It's the connections. Those connections can change, do change dynamically. From the moment you are born, the brain rearranges itself. It's not the number of neurons, it's the connections that contain your memories, that help you perform your actions, that decide what kind of person you are. It's the connections. So Roger Sperry's experiments were very important to understand, well, first of all, the two hemispheres. We have two brains, for whatever reason. He performed those experiments cutting the corpus callosum that connects the two hemispheres, and he realized the two hemispheres behave in different ways, right? And then, yeah, we discovered the REM, which is associated with dreaming. We still don't know exactly how, where, but that's a major progress from Freud. We realized that during REM sleep, something happens to the memories that we accumulated during the day. Some of them get transferred to long-term memory. We discovered there are more than 50 neurotransmitters, latest count. So the brain is not just one network actually. There's 50 different ways, different kinds of messages that neurons exchange. It's much more complex than just a network.
Like the chemicals are different, or what do you mean?
A neurotransmitter is a different chemical, right? Neurons exchange chemicals, and there's 52, I think, more than 50 different kinds of chemicals that they exchange. So some neurons react to some chemicals and don't to others. So it's like having 50 parallel, stacked, different networks, and some neurons belong to more than one. Much more complicated than just a simple network. Okay, so we're understanding more about the brain, and all of these things are still going on, right? I'm sure you heard about synthetic biology. Now we are creating organisms in the lab. This new technique, CRISPR, discovered just 2 or 3 years ago at UC Berkeley to edit genes, which is kind of interesting. And as far as the brain goes, the big difference is that in the 70s, the 80s, new machines came available. We can actually study living brains. And why Roger Sperry's experiments were so important? Because, was it schizophrenia or epilepsy? I mean, so there was only one case in which you were allowed to actually look at the brain of a living person. I think it was epilepsy. And by cutting the corpus callosum, you will, quote unquote, heal the person. Okay? So there was one case where the surgeon was allowed to operate the brain of a living person. Otherwise, everything we knew about brains came from dead people or animals. In the 70s and the 80s, finally, we have machines that can study the brain of living people without killing them. Okay. And then computers, of course. This is what I consider the inventor of the computer as we know it today. It's a German who built 3 machines. The Z3, in my opinion, is the first Turing complete machine, what we today we would call a computer. The first computer built during World War II by the British actually was not a general purpose computer. So. And John von Neumann, 45, designed the architecture that every computer is still using. So the ENIAC, you notice, right? I'm doing it on purpose. The program. Oh, this is how you would. This is the software engineer back then. This is how you program computers back then. You would physically, set. They're setting the instructions, entering the data. It's all done like this. And it's funny, back then, this was called the electronic brain. The media were talking about the electronic brain. So back then, they were already talking about artificial intelligence. It was born as something, to simulate the human brain. So this is the early computers. That's besides the names, but you know, the media consistently call it the electric brain, electronic brain. That's the first commercial computer. Came out in Britain. A few months later, the first US computer. Yeah, the Univac 1. So 1 year later. Those are the early computers. So they were, you probably know this, they were much bigger than this room. Not only they were bigger than this room, but only specialized staff was allowed to see them. I studied when this was still true. You would just go to this window. On the other side there was a computer, you could just see the computer in distance, and you would give a deck of punched cards to the man in white, who was basically the priest of this temple. And then later you would come and pick up your, the output, which usually was a printout. Okay, that's the electronics needed to store a single decimal digit. Your smartphone today can store millions of them. Yes, it's at the Computer History Museum. Computer programmers. So 1947, the transistor is invented. That will change the history, not only of the transistor radio, not only of consumer electronics, but of computers. That's one thing that made computers shrink very rapidly and go faster and be more reliable. Yeah, so luckily AT&T was too big, IBM was too big, so the US government forced them to be nicer to the rest of the world. That helped disseminate the transistor and then helped to disseminate the software. What else we want to do? 1965, when Gordon Moore predicts the processing power of computers will double every 18 months. You probably heard of Moore's law. It's still true to this day. 1971, Intel invents the microprocessor. Silicon Valley is not called Silicon Valley yet, but it's about to be called that way. At this point, the semiconductor becomes a very important constituent of electronic machines. And this is another case in which the science came later. I mean, all this thing was technology evolving not because science had proven something. In fact, very few universities were teaching computer science when computers came out, software when software became big, or semiconductor science when semiconductors became big. You know, universities came after. Well, the early computers, a lot of research was done at the MIT, so there's exceptions, and the Morse School in Philadelphia and Cambridge University. The internet, originally called ARPANET, 1968. You know why the internet was invented, right? The ARPANET. Cold War. It was a military tool to survive a nuclear attack. So anyway, software gets big. First transistor, first application of the transistor, microprocessor. So machine intelligence to me was the original plan actually. When they invented the computer, it was meant to be the electronic brain. And then became a study of its own while the computer was being used for military applications and then business applications and then scientific applications. Then eventually became your smartphone. But originally the ambition was to build an intelligent machine. Cybernetics was born at the same time, if not earlier. It was founded by this man, another man, Norbert Wiener, and other people on the East Coast. And what they realized is that there was a similarity between machines, forget electronic machines, just regular machines, and nature. How do living beings work? They use feedback. There's an input, there's an output, and then there's a feedback where you decide was the output good or bad. If it was bad, you recalibrate, reconfigure yourself to have a different kind of output. And that's how living beings work. And machines work the same way. You know, a steam engine works that way. There's an input, that you want to produce so much. There's an output, this is what a machine does, and then you check if this is okay. Without the feedback, the machine would explode because it would keep trying to do more and more and more and more. But there's feedback that controls the mechanism. Your thermostat at home is the same thing. You set the temperature, and there's a continuous feedback that checks if I reach that temperature. If yes, stop. So they realize that self-regulation applies both in nature and in machines. And that's where they started talking about information and messages, noise. All these terms came to be applied to machines, but originally they were not. Today, if I say that a machine delivers information, it's obvious, but it wasn't. Machines don't deliver information. Machines have motors and gears and metal and whatever. But today it's become commonplace to talk about information delivered by machines. I want to get there. Let's see which ones I want to do. So more and more studies on the brain, and that's we really live in the age where there's more and more studies on the brain. It started with Sperry's experiments, some other experiments in the 60s, the 50s, especially the 60s. Paul MacLean is the one who came up with the theory that our brain has 3 layers. One layer we have in common with reptiles. It's the purely instinctive kind of brain. Then one brain we have in common with mammals, and that takes care of most of our activities. But then we have this neocortex, which is uniquely human and allows us to do things like I'm doing now, the language, and more things. And physically, it's 3 layers in the human brain you can identify. And Jouvet is the one who studied REM sleep. Yerne, more famously, Edelman later. Yerne won a Nobel Prize for the immune system. He explained that the immune system is not a factory that manufactures antibodies. The immune system is making antibodies all the time. And it's an invading organism that selects which one is the right one. And then the immune system will keep doing this one. So it's a selectionist approach to explaining how things work. The immune system does not know what it is doing. It just knows that this is useful, so I keep making a lot more of this. Okay? That's why most vaccines are actually the germ that causes the disease. Because that stimulates the immune system to be ready to fight that thing. So then he applied the same thing to the brain. He said the brain is the same thing. The brain is active. The brain is creating connections more or less randomly. What's driven by the genes, but it's creating connections. And then what happens selects that connections that get stronger, selects the connections that will die because they're useless. It's the environment that selects how your brain works by deciding which connections are useful, which are not useful. Yeah, in philosophy, a lot of pessimism. That's really the philosophy of the last century. Philosophers looking at existence, looking at the society that we're building, and looking at our place in the world and not finding happy answers. A big difference from the age of Confucius, Buddha, Socrates, where they had simple solutions in a sense. Those were actually optimistic philosophies. And Confucius would tell you, well, you just organize the family this way, you organize society this way, and you organize government this way, and you will have happiness. And Buddha was saying, well, yeah, there's suffering out there, but there's a way out of it, through meditation and trying to distance yourself from the material life. And Socrates, was saying, well, philosophy, that's what it does. It makes you wise. We live in the age where philosophers are not optimistic. The philosophy is consistently pessimistic in that it doesn't find a way to live, and also it doesn't find a lot of positive things in science and technology, in the society we are building. So a lot of these philosophers are critics of the society we are building. And a lot of these things is actually interesting because many, they're criticizing, well, media, right? McLuhan, the medium is the message. McLuhan was in this continent. And then the French also attacked the consumer society, attacked the technocratic society, and so on. And a lot of these things go back to the 60s, 70s. And I read articles and books today about the internet that are exactly the same stories. We are just reinventing the same debate that was happening in the ages of the television and the radio. We are reinventing it in the age of Facebook and Google.
And what is the criticism?
Criticism is just the nature of society, how media influence society, how media influence the way you think,
Mm-hmm.
and how technology is creating a big prison instead of giving you freedom. How technology can be used by the government. Foucault called it biopower. Foucault wrote books where he compared the ancient society, modern society, democratic society, and he showed where's freedom. Because it looks at schools, factories, offices, whatever. These are all prisons, So you can see all of these things as limiting your experience, as limiting your life, it's limiting your freedom. So technology, that's been an ongoing debate. That on one hand you see the benefits of technology in the way they make our life more comfortable, but then philosophers see the other way, the other side of the story, where technology makes you less and less human. They limit you either because they hijack your mind or because they create a society in which your freedom is much more limited. You can see this at every level. You're driving on the freeway, if you notice, there's an incredible number of signs. Incredible number of signs. Those signs are consistently limiting your freedom. On the other hand, that's why you're still alive. Otherwise, the chances of having an accident would be much higher.
Mm-hmm.
So on one hand, society uses technology, whether it's just a sign or whether it's a traffic light, Waze or whatever. On one hand, it uses technology to make you more comfortable and safer, but on the other hand, it's really structuring your life. Your life. So a philosopher would ask, is that still your life? So this discussion has been going on actually since the 60s. And in particular with media and with power. Media, the discussion about the internet we have today was going on in the 60s about television. Television was the big thing. Millions of people were watching the news on television. Yeah, but that means television decides what you believe. Radio. And today we do the same with the internet, right? So, and this is actually one of my favorites because Baudrillard is not famous like the other ones, but he had this vision that what is really ruling our society and evolving is objects. From his point of view, we are just vehicles to build better and better objects. But what is civilization about? Objects. We build things. We build pyramids, and then we build something else, and then we build the Roman arch, aqueducts, Today we build smartphones. So you can almost see it as the objects are the thing that is really evolving. We are the same people, we just build objects. You know? Objects are using us, technology is using us to evolve. Right? So and today here in San Francisco, there's a famous writer, Kevin Kelly, who writes about the technium, and he's writing the same thing. He just doesn't know. It's just using the internet. You know, instead, it's using digital technology to have the same discussion, where it's technology that wants to evolve. Technology wants the startups to invent new technology. So, all these things have been around for a while. Greatest invention of the century: undo, the undo command. Yes. For the first time, we have a machine where you can just press a button, Ctrl Z, it's actually 2 buttons, 2 keys, and you can undo what you have done. Fantastic.
Never thought of it that way, but it's so true.
So we have seen the great ideas, by the way. Now it's really just a 20-minute documentary on what happened next. So we walked on the moon. We had the first oil crisis. There was a big psychological shock for the West. And we had plenty of oil. The United States was the #1 world producer. But suddenly we realized that without the Middle East, we don't have enough oil. We still live in that age. Deng Xiaoping seizes power in China. Initially, nobody notices. I mean, Mao died 2 or 3 years earlier. But he's the one who changed China, started the economic reforms that would lead China to become an economic power. The first non-Italian pope, people forget these things, was a major thing in the Catholic Church. The first time in 455 years that the pope was not Italian. And since then, we have not had another Italian pope. At the same time, the Islamic revolution in Iran, very influential, because before that date, the only trouble in the Middle East was about territory. The Arabs were not fighting Israel because we are Muslims, we are Jews. In fact, I'm not even sure if at that point an Egyptian would think of himself as a Muslim. Egypt had a huge population of Christians and the sizable population of Jews. Now this has changed dramatically because all the Christians and Jews have left the Islamic world. But they used to be much more mixed. And 1979 is when we have the first Islamic Republic. You know, that's they seize power in Iran, and that starts something. And then people forget that at one point there were more than 20,000 nuclear warheads. It's incredible the madness of the human race. Just 1,000 would be enough to wipe out life on this planet, except bacteria. And we had 25,000. For what purpose is not clear. And each of these warheads is like 100 times more powerful than Hiroshima, which killed 200,000 people. Anyway, so 1991, the Soviet Union collapses. That's a very important. Historians will write a lot about this. Because before 1991, there really were very few rich countries. I was actually very lucky. I grew up in Italy. It was one of the few countries that really mattered. Because it was just the West, United States, Japan. You know, most of the world was starving. India was starving, China was starving, Africa was starving, Latin America was starving. These countries didn't matter. And Eastern Europe was under communism. So it was relatively easy life. After 1991, things changed dramatically. The whole world becomes capitalist. The whole world starts building, making cheap shoes, and eventually smartphones. Life is very different for kids who grow up today. They have about 7 billion competitors. I had a few 100 million. It's a big difference. What's the other big thing that happens in 91? World Wide Web. Yeah. I'm sure I have it on some of the slides. So anyway, so 1945, the only countries that are democratic is really Western Europe and the United States. Then mid-1970s is when Spain and Portugal also become democratic. 1980s, parts of Latin America become democratic. But then the big wave is after the fall of communism, because then all the communist countries, almost all of them, become democratic, and all the fascists that we supported, but we don't want to say it, they also become democratic. So, like Latin America. Terrorism, as I said, terrorism has been around. I mean, last time I had a slide on how many kings and presidents the anarchists killed. The terrorists we have today haven't killed a single king or president. The last one was killed actually was probably Saddam in Egypt. That was killed by a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. It was 80s. But the terrorists we have today are actually not that successful in killing. They are successful in killing innocent people, yes.